Music is a dialogue. Let's join the conversation. This is the first episode of The Tonic, a tone-based podcast. I'm Lowry Yankwich. Welcome. Before we dive in, a quick shout out that this podcast is made possible by Tonebase, a classical music education platform. All of the interviews included in this episode come directly from Tonebase lessons. Check them out at tonebase.co. Okay, let's dive in. Few pieces in classical music are as beloved as Chopin's first ballade in G minor. The piece seems to have all one could want in a piece for the piano. It's a study in contrasts, like a contest between moods. Delicate, wistful harmony transforms to agitation, but then sweetness returns and builds to a passionate peak. Passion devolves to dancing fingers, and finally explodes in fireworks.
Oh gosh, Chopin makes miracle after miracle in this piece.
That's pianist Garrick Ohlsson.
It remains to this day one of the most satisfying and thrilling and still somewhat unusual pieces somehow.
Today, we're going to follow Ohlsson's lead and explore what makes the G minor ballade unusual, even revolutionary for its time. And we'll hear from an all-star cast of celebrated musicians whose lives and careers the ballade has shaped. This is what we'll do each episode of The Tonic, but with different music, different themes, and different musicians each episode, delving into great works of music to see how they relate to their time and how they've influenced musicians since then. Let's get started. It was a performance of Chopin's first ballade that turned a switch in Garrick Ohlsson at a young age.
I guess I have to begin at my own beginning.
It was 1957. Ohlsson was a young boy living just outside New York City, and he got his first opportunity to hear the great pianist Artur Rubinstein play at Carnegie Hall.
And the hall was packed, and there were people sitting on stage, and people were more excited than usual at a piano recital. And he began with the F-sharp minor Polonaise of Chopin, which is quite something to begin with. And I was blasted into orbit, as they say about astronauts. I feel as if I remember hearing every note.
It was an all-Chopin program, a Rubinstein special.
And the last piece on the program was the G minor ballade, and I remember vividly hearing the first theme and thinking I had never heard anything so beautiful, so melancholy and so beautiful in my life. And then he played the second theme, and I thought, this is even more beautiful than the first. And the coda, which I already knew as an ambitious 9-year-old, was horribly hard, struck me as being incredibly thrilling. Rubinstein just ate it up, and it was just thrilling beyond belief. That's when I said to myself, that's what I want to do. That's when I decided I wanted to be a concert pianist.
Something about Chopin's music lit a fire in Ohlsson. He went on to become the first and only American pianist to win the Warsaw International Chopin Competition, so I guess things worked out. The G minor ballade has been inspiring musicians for literally centuries. The great composer Robert Schumann especially loved it.
This piece got a rave review from Robert Schumann, who was a great critic as well as a great composer. He was friends with Chopin, and at one point when Chopin was making his first tour of Europe, he stopped in, I think Schumann was in Leipzig at that point, and Schumann said something to Chopin like, Of all your works that I know, this is my favorite so far, and Chopin apparently agreed.
Schumann later wrote that the piece was one of Chopin's wildest and most original. What is it about this music that's so special? In this episode, I'll focus on one aspect, the ballade's opening. The piece begins with a sleight of hand. Although the piece is in G minor, the first measures outline a major chord, A flat major.
Let me play you those first bars with no particular interpretation. So we know we're here, but then he changes direction, makes a curlicue around, and takes you away from A flat, but not definitively. There's no harmony in it yet.
Our ear is reaching to make sense of the music. The notes we hear are bare, without accompaniment, creating a sense of uncertainty. Here it is again. Then that major feeling curdles with the introduction of a single note that doesn't belong. Listen to where he takes that A flat major chord.
So he curls around the A flat, which is fine, but suddenly, whoops, we're in a different place now. What's happening?
It's the F sharp, that wrong note, that introduces the possibility that we might be in a different key than we thought. With a single note, Chopin changes the meaning of A flat, suggesting that what he's just outlined isn't really our home key, but the lead up to a different key. It's functioning as a special chord called a Neapolitan, a major chord based a half step above the main key. Let me break it down really quickly and try to show why the Neapolitan is tricky and cool. Our home key in the ballade is G minor, which is this chord. Chopin hides the ball by starting not on the G minor chord, but on this different chord, the Neapolitan. If you play the Neapolitan and G minor side by side, they sound very different and not related. Here's the G minor chord again, and here's the Neapolitan. But actually, they're connected by a single chord, D major, which is known as the dominant chord in G minor. This is D major, and it leads stronger than any other chord to G minor, what's known as the tonic. A classic way to approach the dominant chord is to play this chord before it. That's the 2 chord, which is based on the note A. Here it is again. And here's how the progression from 2 to the dominant chord to G minor sounds. That progression is very, very common. The Neapolitan, even though it sounds so different than G minor, is actually only one note different than that 2 chord. It's like a twist on the 2 chord. Here's the 2 again, and now here's the Neapolitan. A single note separates those 2 chords, and yet they give totally different flavors to the music. Here's the common 2-5-1 progression. And here's the progression using the Neapolitan instead. That's what Chopin is playing with in this introduction, and why I mentioned a sleight of hand. That Neapolitan chord sounds like it's in a totally different key, but it turns out it can function in exactly the same way as a chord that is the bread and butter of G minor. It's like a magic trick. You think the ball's in one hand, and then suddenly realize it's in the other. And it makes me wonder whether Chopin even knew where he was headed when he first started playing the opening melody. This is pianist Rebecca Pennies.
So this is really... It makes it like, wow, this is Chopin improvising.
Chopin was known for his improvising, mostly of ornamental filigree on top of his melodies. That kind of improvisational style shows up elsewhere in the Ballade. Many colleagues and students of Chopin's also described how he sometimes entered a kind of dream world while sitting at the piano.
He allows himself to go on trips. There's so many trips, so many reports of him going into a trance when he was at the piano.
Even if Chopin thought deeply about what he wanted to do before writing this piece, the opening gives us that improvisational feel, which adds to the narrative aspect of the music. These first bars are shrouded in mystery. Where will we go?
I want music to be narrative. I wanted to tell a story.
That's pianist and Juilliard professor Jerome Lowenthal. Lowenthal argues that music intrinsically tells a story, one that it's up to the performer to discover and let speak. We often think of music as a form of self-expression, placing the identity of the performer front and center. But what if the performer is only a conduit for the music?
I think music has a life of its own, and it acquires meaning that it didn't have when the composer wrote it. And so, I don't want to hear, which I do hear, or something like it. And this has nothing to do with freedom. It has to do with whether one is thinking, creating nice little cells for the music to be imprisoned by.
Lowenthal's point, I think, is that there's an act of liberation involved in the interpretation of music. Liberation of oneself, maybe, but really liberation of the music. There's a story that the music wants to tell, that the performer must tap into, decipher. And just as plots repeat themselves, so do musical stories. Lowenthal points out how the opening notes of the Ballade are the same as many other works across genres. The Ballade opens with a bang, and then 4 rising notes.
I like to tell students, this of course is.
Those 4 notes appear in Chopin's Third Scherzo.
It's
And they appear in Brahms' D minor piano concerto.
And it's even Cole Porter. Don't fence me. That's the same story.
Oh, give me land, lots of land under starry skies above. Don't...
Clearly, there are major differences in the mood of Don't Fence Me In and Chopin's G minor Ballade. What they share isn't the whole story, but a storytelling device, like how fairy tales begin with Once Upon a Time. Maybe Don't Fence Me In is more Hansel and Gretel, and the Ballade is more Little Red Riding Hood. But they both start in the same place. And it's up to the performer to follow that narrative thread from beginning to end.
Don't fence me in.
Okay, let's get back to the opening. So Chopin gets to the F sharp, that twinge of uncertainty, and decides to follow it. Then we get to the real crux of the opening.
And he finally gives you the first harmony of the piece, and this is one of the most significant bars in all of music of its time because of what he does to it. So let me just play that all again in sort of fast motion just to get that into your ear. Then it changes. Mysterious. Sort of asking, if you will, why, what? Then we get the first harmony, which is a C minor chord. Don't know where that's come from. But listen to what he does in one note in the left hand. Ah! That's a howling dissonance for its time. Even now, it's still intense. Oh, it hurts.
This clash may not sound that painful, but it's important to put it in the context of Chopin's time.
We no longer consider that a coarse, brutal dissonance, but at the time, many people would have said, "How dare you?"
In fact, an early editor of this ballade thought that Chopin just made a mistake.
The reasoning that was given was that such a refined, elegant composer as Chopin could not have meant such a coarse, ugly dissonance. It must have been a slip of the pen.
It's easy to forget how revolutionary this music was to earlier generations.
Since the premiere of The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky, which was a scandal because of its modernism, we've had over 100 years of music since then, so we're no longer shocked at The Rite of Spring. We're no longer shocked at the Beethoven Fifth Symphony. But these were shocking things in the culture of their time. And we can't recapture that exactly, but sometimes when you begin to look at how these things are put together and what's actually going, you can begin to get that sense of wonder too.
The music of the ballade was revolutionary in certain ways. That dissonant chord, for instance. But also the whole concept of a piano ballade was new. Ballades existed in literature and as songs for voice. They were also common in French opera, where they were generally simple narrative songs. In this ballade from the opera La Dame Blanche by Boieldieu, the singer describes a ghost who watches over the castle of Avenel. But no one had written a ballade for the piano alone, especially not one without some words attached. The ballade had been a narrative form expressed through language, but Chopin transformed it into narrative told just through music. Chopin wrote 4 ballades, and it is a constant point of fascination for pianists, trying to determine what story the music tells. Take Chopin's second ballade, for example. This is pianist Gary Grafman performing. For him, the second ballade tells a famous story in Polish folklore of a lake that protected a village from destruction. Derivatives of the story were immortalized by the Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz.
Hundreds of years ago, it was a village, there was no lake, and an invading army was approaching.
The villagers knew they couldn't defeat the advancing soldiers.
And they prayed that some miracle should save them.
The miracle was the lake. It appeared and washed over them, protecting the village.
And they were under the lake, and the lake was totally calm. But once in a while there's a storm. A ferocious storm. Lightning and turbulence and so forth. And then it goes away, and again, it's like glass, this lake.
In folklore, the lake alternates between serenity and violence, as if to remind us that even in peace, danger is always close at hand. Same goes with the music. Grafman's is only one, albeit a popular, interpretation, but it's an example of the way that interpreters look beyond the music to derive a narrative. Interpretation is, at least in part, an exercise in creating associations, drawing connections. For example, some scholars have compared the opening of the G minor ballade to a song by Bellini, who Chopin both knew and admired. First, recall the opening to the ballade. Now, listen to the opening of this aria, L'Abbandono by Bellini. It too starts on the Neapolitan and is in G minor. there are some similarities, right? That low boom in the bass, the hands traveling up the keyboard in unison, the mysterious quality. Of course, there are plenty of reasons to think that Chopin didn't have this song in mind when he sat down to write the Ballade. But certain interpreters might make something of this possible connection and use that to inform their playing. Chopin loved opera and admired singers. He used to tell students, "You must sing if you wish to play." The great Chopin interpreter Vladimir Horowitz made much of the singing quality of Chopin's music.
He always talked about singers, how important it is to listen to singers.
That's pianist Emanuel Ax. He first heard Horowitz as a teenager in a famous concert at Carnegie Hall.
I was at that concert. I was online for a weekend to buy tickets, literally for a weekend in front of Carnegie Hall.
What Ax points out about Horowitz is his way of imbuing every note with meaning, in the way that a singer might. It's a way of bringing consciousness or narrative into the music.
The line always has life. It bends. You never hear 6 notes in a row that are the same, which the singer would never do.
Here's how Horowitz began the Ballade in his 1965 concert at Carnegie Hall, where a young Ax was present. Listening again now, Ax perceives interpretive choices in every note.
Stop there for a second. So first of all, he goes up here, da, 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 and then you'll notice there's more on the, da, 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 and as he goes down, this becomes, in the middle, he slightly changes the balance. He shone a light on things that were important to him that I think other people didn't hear.
All the notes may be written down, but that doesn't mean that the story is fixed. It's like how in speech, emphasis on one word can totally change the implication of a sentence. What's so interesting about music is that even if we agree that there's meaning to find in the music, different musicians come to different conclusions about what's important. Horowitz had one view. Ax may have another. After the dissonant chord, Chopin leaves one note hanging. Listen carefully. Here.
And that's part of the storytelling aspect of this piece. In other words, Chopin sort of proposes, let me tell you something, but he leaves you hanging.
Here it is again. The hanging note is like a hand extended. We're at the doorstep to the piece. Do we take the hand and walk inside? What's interesting is that the boundary between ending and beginning, between outside and inside in our doorstep analogy, isn't actually clear. The music is ambiguous. This is what comes right after the hanging note.
What Chopin writes in the first notes of this melody, with this beautiful curve and descent, is a resolution of what came before. It's a resting point.
Olson is responding to a common interpretation that these notes you just heard are really the beginning of the first theme, the beginning of the story.
And very often I hear, as if we're already now underway in our journey in the story.
There's always a question with this piece. Mm-hmm. Well, how does it work? Now, is this the resolution or the beginning?
Whether a musician thinks of this figure as an ending or as a beginning affects how they play it. This is how one might play it as a beginning.
A lot of people play ta-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
And yet, Axe and Olson both see it as an end. This is how Axe plays it. I'm giving a bit of the lead up. The duality of this opening figure is yet another reminder of how seriously musicians think about what the music is trying to tell them. Is it an ending or a beginning? Where does the story start? When do we step inside? So, what is the story that Chopin tells in this ballade? The musicologist Carol Berger has argued that Chopin used his ballades as a vehicle to tell the story of a Poland that could be. In the years following the French Revolution, what we now know as Poland was carved up and contested between imperial European powers. Chopin, known for his patriotism, wrote the ballade while in exile in Paris in the early 1830s. Only a few years earlier, Poles had rebelled against the Russian Empire. The revolt was unsuccessful and led the Russian Empire to clamp down on Poles, bringing them closer into the Russian fold. The first ballade, through a political lens, becomes a call for revolution, of how the Poles, beaten down, might one day rise. This political telling is yet another way of conceiving of the music. Depending on where one looks, to history, to society, to other art, one finds different meaning in the music. Indeed, Chopin is known for having never played his own music the same way twice. Listen to how different even the first measures of the ballade can be. This is pianist Seymour Bernstein. And this is Rebecca Penny's, creating atmospheric mist through tactful use of the pedal. I think Chopin would agree with this fluidity of interpretation. He once said to a student, quote, "When you're at the piano, I give you full authority to do whatever you want. Follow freely the ideal you've set for yourself and which you must feel within you. Be bold and confident in your own powers and strength, and whatever you say will always be good." I interpret Chopin to mean that the musician must find a principle, a way of seeing the music, must form an opinion and share it. With that in mind, let's hear the opening measures of this ballade one more time. This is Artur Rubinstein, performing live in 1963. Thanks for listening. In this podcast, you heard excerpts from interviews with Garrick Olson, Rebecca Pennies, Emanuel Axe, Seymour Bernstein, and Jerome Lowenthal. All of the interviews you heard today came directly from Tone-Based Lessons. In these lessons, you can learn a whole lot more about the Chopin G minor ballade and all sorts of other aspects of classical repertoire and technique. Visit tonebase.co to subscribe. Thanks again, and see you next episode, in which we'll dive into the music of Brahms through the eyes of the late pianist Leon Fleischer.